Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session, The Leap to Global, as part of the Fame Plus Market Days program. My name is Anusha Kutigan, and I'm the Head of Advisory at Vogue Business. In this presentation, we're going to be looking at how Filipino fashion brands and businesses can scale on a global level, particularly in the context of the post-COVID-19 recovery phase. We're also going to be looking at the different innovations that are driving the industry forward. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to be looking at 4 different areas. Firstly, we'll look at the growth trajectories that are driving the industry in the socio-economic context. Then we'll look at what's trending, the hottest topics and trends that fashion brands are capitalizing on. And then we'll look at where innovation is coming from, both in terms of established brands and businesses that are driving innovation, or in some cases, investing in startups. And then we'll also look at newcomers and emergent players and where innovation is being developed by them. And then finally, we'll look at where to play and how to win by exploring opportunities and recommendations for Filipino fashion brands. And throughout this presentation, we'll discuss lots of different case studies and examples at all levels of the industry to bring these different strategies to life. So firstly, if we look at the growth trajectories and the socioeconomic context, we can see that the luxury industry is expected to grow considerably, according to data by BCG. In the context of COVID-19, a full recovery is expected between the end of 2021 and 2022. And then when we look at that on a segment level, the luxury personal goods industry, although expected to grow significantly by 2025, it is actually going to account for a smaller proportion of the overall luxury industry. And I'll come on to that in a minute. Now, I don't want this to ring any alarm bells because that segment is going to be expanding from an estimated $340 billion today to around $390 billion by 2025, with the potential for that segment to grow to $440 billion by that year. And that really depends on different economics scenarios. Of course, there is still a lot of uncertainty in the world today. But when we take the total picture of the luxury market, it's actually experiences that are driving development and expected to expand further. And that suggests that there could be opportunities to collaborate or extend into sectors such as homewares or hospitality and leisure, perhaps by collaborating with hotels, for example, to really deliver further commercial success. Now, when we look at this on a regional level, it's really important to note that the post-COVID-19 recovery is taking place at a different pace depending on the city you're in. Now, in London, retail is heading in the right direction, but it's actually having a slower recovery than cities such as Paris, Tokyo, and Amsterdam. And in fact, there's a much bigger recovery in progress in cities such as Rome, Stockholm, Milan, and New York. So when you're considering which markets to either expand in or grow your footprint, or where you might have physical retail stockists, it's very important to note where the faster pace of recovery is taking place and be prepared to see perhaps slower return on investment in those cities that are taking a slower trajectory towards recovery. And we know that online has had a huge moment over the course of the pandemic. It's been the primary way in which consumers have been accessing fashion goods. According to a study conducted by Zalando Marketing Services in collaboration with 118 fashion brands on its platform, we can see that actually online sales are expected to account for 57% of all sales for the brands that participated in that study. And there's a real focus on commercial performance online, especially among smaller brands and businesses that are currently seeing revenue of under 100 million euro. So if you are one of those businesses that's operating around 100 million euros or less, then it's really important to be aware that your rivals in that revenue segment are going to be investing heavily in digital, and that's where you're going to see more fierce competition. Now, the way that a number of luxury brands are accessing bigger audiences is by entering into stockist agreements with larger multi-brand sites such as Net-a-Porter or Farfetch. And while that's a really great way to access much bigger audiences in very developed luxury markets, it is also important to note that it does put you at the mercy of those platforms for pricing and positioning and perception of brands. And there's been a lot of discounting activity in those environments. And that actually means that some brands have been shirking participation in these platforms in a bid to have more control over their pricing and the way that they are distributed to consumers. So brands like Burberry are investing a lot more in D2C. So that's direct to consumer and actually shying away from that multi-brand environment. So that's just something that's worth being aware of if you're pursuing that kind of relationship in order to reach a bigger audience, that there may be a compromise that you have to make when it comes to pricing because you may not always have control over the way that you are positioned in that environment. That noted, we know there are plenty of opportunities in online, and that's true of both developed markets and emerging markets as well. Now, India presents a really interesting case study for how luxury is actually almost leapfrogging the physical retail distribution history that has been so important to the growth of the luxury industry historically, and almost going straight to digital. And there are a number of different platforms that are really starting to succeed in this space. Now, I say this conservatively because luxury growth in e-commerce in India has been quite slow, but it's certainly starting to accelerate. And you see platforms like Darby's that are really investing in this space and onboarding a number of premium and luxury fashion brands and really cultivating a niche with that audience. But there are other aspects of the industry that are still struggling, and that has been particularly dampened by COVID-19. So certain crafts like embroidery, which is a huge industry in India, that has really suffered during the pandemic. And those ateliers are really relying on the bounce back of international shoppers in order to improve their fortunes. And that is something that's going to be slower because they are particularly trading with the European luxury fashion houses. And we know that the growth of European luxury in some places is considerably slower. And that is a space that is also relying a lot more on international visitors and retail tourism. And until that aspect of the industry recovers, like retail tourism, they are dependent on domestic consumption. And because that has been slow to recover, the trickle-down effect is that suppliers in markets such as India are continuing to struggle. And that is going to be an aspect of the industry that takes longer to recover. However, there are opportunities too. Menswear is a really good example. And there are particular categories in India among menswear that are really important to driving forward the market. Denim is one of them. Tailoring is another, and polo shirts and leisure wear. We're actually seeing certain approaches to the market, such as made to measure and custom made suits, now transcending that category and actually creating opportunities in some of those more casual wear categories too. So if you are a brand or a business that is seeking to invest in emerging markets such as India, it's worth noting that there are huge opportunities both in online and in those categories, particularly in menswear as well, that historically has been under indexed in the luxury space, but is now really a booming opportunity. And then there are, of course, those values that are really starting to underpin developments in the industry. And they're starting to become mandatory for participating in the luxury scene. One of those values is diversity, and this is something that is certainly becoming a priority in markets like the US and the UK. We can see coalitions forming to encourage more creativity and representation, for example, from Indigenous artists. And then we can see a lot more attention being paid to sustainability. And that is something that is a huge priority the world over. And as we see more world leaders and government agencies start to tackle specific challenges in the sustainability context, it's worth noting that those initiatives are starting to be legally mandated as well. And so if you're not prepared for those changes, and that's something that you need to start building into your business model now. Otherwise, it'd be really difficult to operate in those cross-border relationships without being able to show that you're meeting the government standard. And that's true not just for the environment, but also for the way that we treat people in the fashion industry and along the supply chain. And you already have this very localized effort, for example, in California, where garment labor laws are starting to have global implications for businesses that want to trade on a regional level. So it's really important to be aware of those different government agencies and not only the values that are rising from the grassroots organizations up, but also that they're being trickled down from authorities and global authorities, and they're having a huge impact on the way that we trade internationally too. And then it's worth noting that those values as a currency of relevance they're not just a Western ideal. Although it splashes across the headlines, particularly strong in the US and certainly in the UK as well and across Europe, it's something that is starting to become a huge priority for a number of emerging markets that are very important to the growth of the luxury industry too. So for example, in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and the latest Sao Paulo Fashion Week actually set quotas for the diversity of models that were being put on the runways. So again, if you are looking to participate in those global fashion showcases, which are starting to bounce back now, then you have to be aware of the expectations of the audiences in those markets too. So next we're going to look a little bit more at the hottest topics that are trending in the fashion industry and where there's real dynamism coming into the scene. The first big trend is authenticity and relevance, and the way that brands are taking inspiration from personal stories and culture in this age of diversity that I've just described. The example that you can see in the first picture is from First Nations fashion, which is a designer's collection created by a designer, an Indigenous Native American designer from the US called Jill Sater. And her creations not only represent the design traditions of the Native American communities, but they also seek to create awareness of violence against women from those communities and the horrific circumstances that they have often encountered that are actually far more compounded for women in those communities versus a number of other minorities in the US. The next example of those personal stories is a really beautiful campaign that was run by a jewelry brand that I'm a particular fan of called Hefeng. And in this collection, created by Sun Hefeng, the creative director, she was promoting her latest Mother's Day range, inspired by daisies. And the whole story behind this was her relationship with her mother and the values that her mother passed down from her generation to Sun Hefeng, the director, and values that she now passes down to her own daughter. And the concept was that when you blow on a daisy, those seeds get scattered and the qualities of that flower are then expanded to new horizons. And it was a really beautiful story that was then built into the product as well as the marketing. And finally, a change in the industry that I think is really interesting is that you can now see the stories of newcomers to different designer labels, bringing their personal stories and adding that to the heritage of Western brands too. A really great example is the creative direction of Olivier Rousteing at Balmain, which is a heritage brand from Paris. And he is a designer who comes from a Black African background. He was adopted. He rose through the ranks of the fashion industry, and he's now the creative director of this huge global brand. And his personal story, coming from a minority background, coming from a disadvantaged background, is now part of that brand story of Balmain, which is it's a real stepping stone in an industry that has been quite exclusive historically. The second trend is that development of closed loop services in an industry that is seeking to be more sustainable. But what I think is really important to note is the way that brands are connecting those sustainability initiatives to clienteling and creating a, a great experience for luxury consumers. One great example is Hyatt Denim, which is a brand that was popularized by Meghan Markle, and it is a denim brand that actually revived a whole industry of sewing and fashion and textiles in a place called Cardigan in the UK that had suffered during the recession, and a lot of those factories had been closed down. And when the founders of this brand were looking for a place to base their manufacturing, they looked for a town that already had those skills among the local population. And it actually wound up reviving that skill set and bringing a huge amount of trade to the local economy. So that's just a bit of the story about the brand. But what it offers as a service is free repairs for life. It creates a community around a set of values and ways of wearing the denim products. And provided that you can show that you are a part of that community and you are following the guidance about how to wear their jeans, they promise free repairs for life. So really creating that sustainable service offering that builds a community and reassures customers of the quality and the service that they will get. The next one is around pre-reservation and pre-ordering. And this is something that companies like My Theresa are offering across a number of brands, such as Bottega Veneta. And the benefit of this is that you are able to create a level of predictability of what's going to be ordered from your brand or from your retailer. And that helps to reduce waste because then you don't overorder your inventory, you don't overorder product, and you're able to create that prediction about the amount of product you're going to need and the level of demand for different products. And finally, there's the initiatives around the circular economy. And companies like Farfetch are setting quite hard deadlines. So by 2030, Farfetch says that it wants more than 50% of its products to be upcycled, pre-owned, resold, donated, or repaired through the platform. So it's really worth noting that if you're going to be participating in a relationship with a retailer such as Farfetch, you have to be able to prove how your business can help achieve those sustainability goals, and by proxy, help create a really great environment and experience for its customers. And just in relationship to that, I wanted to share an interesting example that I found while I was researching for this presentation. This is an advert that I found for a new personal shopping and client relations manager by My Theresa. And it was just really interesting to note that two of the key responsibilities for that role were going to be driving that pre-reservation target 4 times a year with clients, and also creating VIP events and extraordinary experiences for its top customers. So they're really investing in the people power to deliver excellence through those different initiatives. The third trend is something that is a huge talking point for the entire team at Vogue Business, and that is all about the metaverse and using virtual identity as a new form of self-expression. And this is quite a shiny new tool and innovation, and huge brands like Balenciaga have been investing quite aggressively in this space. One of the more famous initiatives is its partnership with Fortnite, where it's created virtual designs for characters within the video game. But there are smaller brands that are participating in this too. So a particularly favorite example of mine is a tailoring atelier called Joshua Kane. That's the eponymous label of Joshua Kane here in the UK. It has one store in London, but he has expanded from products to cultural initiatives, like developing a video game inspired by his tailoring. He has a motif that runs throughout a number of collections that is inspired by 3 tailors from the Victorian age. And he's taken that concept of the 3 tailors in the Victorian era and made them characters in a video game that he's developing, that where all of the characters are wearing his designs. And it's a really creative enterprise. And actually, it's quite a slow process because it is a small business and it is a costly initiative. But by token of doing it slowly, he's also sharing that story and that journey of developing the video game with his audience and really making them feel like a part of that journey as he develops this new form of entertainment. Speaking of entertainment, content-tainment is a really important trend in the industry too. And this is all about the demand for luxury brands to educate and entertain as well as engage. And this is something that's taking place both in the physical sphere and in the digital sphere. So, for example, in the physical sphere, we can see brands like Saint Laurent that are really interacting with this demand for luxury culture by creating lots of different experiences and products. So it's Rive Droit in Paris offers everything from limited edition products to vintage music, photography, and art. And the brand's also started selling lifestyle products in London this year. And then if we take the example of a smaller up and coming brand like Ganni is using its social media channels to share very authentic stories of real people from different walks of life. And sometimes these people have very small personal audiences, only in the region of around 3,000 to 10,000 compared to the millions of followers that luxury brands operating on a global scale often have. But they are showing that it's important to them as a brand to share those authentic stories of real people too. And that is really stimulating engagement for its followers. And the final trend is all about social sustainability and actually stewarding artisanal skills and cottage crafts as well as you develop your businesses. And again, this is something that both incumbent brands and smaller luxury labels are doing. So Gucci has created a new initiative called Gucci Vault that builds on the collaborations it's had with larger brands like Balenciaga and the North Face. And in this initiative, it's actually supporting 13 young designer labels which feature on this new online platform. And it's really helping to stimulate excitement among Gen Z. Another really good example is a brand called Zeus and Dion that actually was founded at the peak of the last recession in around 2011, at the height of the Greek economic crisis. And to base their manufacturing, they actually selected a factory in Soufli, which was a region that was historically quite famous for silk craft and had really suffered during the recession. And similarly to Hyatt, the denim brand that I spoke about earlier, it actually revived a whole local trade and enabled the region to retain that skill set in the silk world, which would have been lost had that factory not been invested in by Zeus and Dion. Next, we're going to be looking at where innovation is coming from in the industry. And I'd like to start this off by looking at how the 4Ps of marketing are evolving. We know that familiar model: product, price, place, and promotion. But at Vogue Business, we can increasingly see principles of purpose, pride, partnerships, and positioning driving marketing, and by the same token, actually helping to stimulate more innovation in the industry. And in this section, we're going to be looking at lots of different examples from both those established brands in the luxury sphere and newcomers that are really helping to drive novelty in the market. So firstly, if we look at product, we can see that material innovation is helping to combat waste and ecological damage. One example is a company called MycoWorks, which uses biotechnology to grow made-to-order mycelium materials that mimic animal leather. And this company is actually due to drop its first collaborative bag with Hermes by the end of 2021. And actually, the former director of Hermes, Patrick Thomas, says that alternative leathers could actually account for 10% of the luxury goods industry over the next 2 decades. And then there's an example from a brand that I'm sure a number of viewers today are going to be familiar with, which is a Philippines-based company called Pinatex, which has supplied its pineapple leaf material to footwear collaborations with brands such as Paul Smith and Hugo Boss. The next innovation is around how those values can actually enable more competitive pricing, particularly in sustainability. And I actually really love this example, which comes from a leggings brand called Tala. And what the founders of this brand discovered was that it was really expensive to create 100% sustainable products. They found that when they tried to aim for 100% sustainable products by using completely recycled materials, their leggings were coming out at around £100 on an average price point. And that made it quite prohibitive for most consumers, even premium consumers, because that is a really high price point for leggings. And then when they did a little bit more research, they found that actually if they reduced that by just 80% and made their products from 92% upcycled textiles, they could almost halve that price point to £42. And and that just shows that by making that small trade-off, they were able to achieve much more competitive pricing while still creating a product that in the main was very sustainable and significantly more sustainable than the other offerings out there in the mainstream. Um, Thirdly, if we look at place, we can see that newer brands are also starting to change their business models by scaling up through globalization. So this brand, Farm Rio, a premium fashion brand from Brazil, has had significant success in international markets. And the reason it's had that success is it's actually created satellite manufacturing hubs in different markets. If it had retained all of its manufacturing in Brazil, its costs would have doubled. But by basing its manufacturing in different markets such as Morocco and Turkey and Portugal, it's been able to compete with its US rivals, and that has really helped it to scale up globally. It also resisted going global too soon and focused on prioritizing online sales in its domestic market and perfecting that, so that it had a really strong domestic customer base and a strong online business model that could operate as a proof of concept as it was building international relationships too. The next change that we're seeing is the way that brands are marketing themselves. And this is really all about using the right people at the right moment in promotional strategies. A really good example is the way that luxury brands are working with South Korean celebrity ambassadors. And I think that this is really important to note because that South Korean celebrity scene is no longer a local phenomenon. It's actually something that's helping to drive sales on an international level too. So Squid Game has been one of Netflix's most successful series to date. And Louis Vuitton was one of the first luxury brands to actually jump on this pop culture hit by appointing one of the stars, Ho Young-jun, as its main ambassador in the region. And the significance of that is that she's such a recognizable character based on the success of the Netflix hit. And it's a really curious move for Louis Vuitton, but it really shows the power of a luxury brand engaging with that pop culture. Similarly, for Dior, Blackpink's Jisoo alone represents 64% of Dior's $7 million in earned media revenue. And that's real evidence that K-pop stars do continue to be one of the most powerful ambassadors for brands today. And then if we look at those newer approaches to innovation and marketing that I mentioned, see that purpose and creating business models based on ethical values is something that is much more important to newcomers in this industry. Oxford Fashion Studio is actually a company that I personally have worked with for a number of years, and it specializes in bringing emerging talent from around the world to the major fashion capitals such as London, Paris, New York, and Milan. And it has really interesting values right at the heart of the business. It's a company that recognizes that the fashion industry can often have a lot of egos involved. It can sometimes be a challenging environment to operate. And therefore, it takes a very humble approach to the way that it interacts with its designers. It's also positioned itself as a company that will work flexibly depending on the budget of those designers as well. And they actually say it on their website. We never take it for granted. If for whatever reason you want to move on, then it's just 30 days notice. So it really gives those emergent designers that it's supporting that financial flexibility too. Being authentic is really important to this organization, making sure that new brands are able to tell their stories. And the example that I gave earlier of First Nations fashion, the collection created by an Indigenous artist from America, that was one of the brands that was supported by Oxford Fashion Studio to take its brand to those global showcases. And finally, setting new industry standards in environmental issues is a huge priority. And so they're very selective about the new designers that they work with, making sure that those collections embed those sustainability principles in all of their products so that they can show to the world and to the press and media and buyers that they showcase to that the brands that they're supporting are really creating positive change in the industry too. And then if we look at Pride, it's great to see how new platforms are celebrating heritage and debunking stereotypes. Some of you may already be familiar with a platform called Diet Prada, which has become one of the most feared Instagram accounts in the last few years. And the main focus of that Instagram account is exposing businesses that take advantage of other brands, like copycat designs, or that treat their staff poorly. And this platform, Diet Prada, was created by a South Asian woman originally from New Zealand, now living in the UK, to celebrate South Asian creatives. And a number of South Asian communities have historically faced a lot of discrimination and carry a lot of shame as a consequence. And this platform is all about debunking those stereotypes, showing the shame, and really celebrating the creativity of South Asian culture. And then if we look at the impact on positioning when it comes to these new values and innovations, we can see that hyper-personalization is resulting in co-creative products between consumers and brands that are helping to augment the exclusivity of products and that perception of exclusivity, whilst also encouraging pre-orders, which is something that I mentioned earlier as a way to limit waste. And this is again being done by both larger global luxury brands and smaller premium fashion businesses. Gucci DIY, for example, enables customers to add customized finishes to a huge range of products by choosing monograms, different colors, swatches, patches, and materials. And you can pre-order those products with a huge level of personalization. But then you also get smaller brands like this company, Same But Different, a US company that uses 3D knitting robots to create custom-made knitwear that are made entirely to the spec of the customer. And again, you create that highly personalized product and then you pre-order it. And there is no waste at all. It's a zero waste production facility that uses local US cotton. So highly sustainable in its approach to production as well. And then we know that partnerships are a really important way of driving commercial success. This is something that incumbents have recognized, and it's something that they've been doing between each other at a much more highly commercial level. But now they're recognizing their responsibility as industry leaders, not just market leaders, by partnering with startup companies too. Prada Group, for example, is going to be a primary partner in the Milan-based startup bootcamp Fashion Tech, which is the first fashion-focused hub for the accelerator. So finally, we're just going to look at some opportunities and recommendations for Filipino fashion brands and businesses that are looking to take forward the information that have been received in this session and the other sessions that you're going to be hearing over the course of the Fame Plus Marketplace program, and look at some four key takeaways. The first one is to strike when incumbents stall. And the reason I say this is that some luxury fashion brands have been really slow in the way that they've responded to COVID-19 And the bounce back has been slow and they've been very hesitant. And I noticed this personally, and particularly in London during London Fashion Week last month. It was the first time since the pandemic that brands were able to showcase in person again. But a number of the usual suspects, like Burberry, were missing from the lineup and missing from that main show schedule. And what it meant was that it gave an opportunity for smaller brands that have only developed their offerings quite recently to garner a lot more excitement and a lot more media attention by taking advantage of the absence of those bigger players. So brands like Regina Piro, which only really launched around 2014, really took advantage of that moment and created huge hype through a very creative show that actually took place at the London Aquatic Centre, which was where the London Olympics water sports programme took place in 2012. And she put her collections on models who actually walked onto the diving boards after circling the pool and finished the show with a diving performance by the GB's GB's swimming team for the Olympics. So it was a really exciting show and one that embraced swimming culture and really brought that element of fun and summer and swimming to its spring summer collection showcase. The second recommendation is to build your own collaborative communities. We've spoken about a number of partnerships and collaborations that have been conducted by larger fashion brands and businesses, but actually it's really possible for brands and businesses in the Philippines, perhaps brands and businesses that are even attending this event, to collaborate on their own products and collections and collaborate on their own marketing initiatives too. Successful collaboration can come from smaller brands that are willing to work together and share design ideas and resources and those audiences as well. So do things like Instagram takeovers of your feeds, work together to collaborate on different categories, perhaps using those relationships to extend into some of those sectors, such as homewares or hospitality and leisure that I mentioned are going to possibly be driving further commercial success in the future. A good example of how this has been done successfully is a collaboration between Palace, which is well known for its skateboarding culture and designs that are aimed at that community, and a brand called Arc'teryx that is well known for climbing culture and the great outdoors. And it was a really great cultural collaboration that united two different communities that embrace those different outdoor pursuits and brought them together in a very cohesive collection where the different logos were superimposed on the product. And there's a very exciting collaboration that brought together not only two different brands, but two different cultures as well. Thirdly, it's about forging the right relationships as well. I've already spoken at length about different collaborations, but it's also important to know what's going to be a priority for the relationships that you're trying to forge with stockists and retailers too. It's not just about the media and buyers that you need to impress, although that's obviously important. But you need to make sure that you're instigating relationships with other decision makers too, particularly the sustainability director, which is becoming a far more important and influential role at retailers. A number of sustainability directors at established retailers are starting to use tools like the Higg Index, which is a measurement tool created by the Sustainable Apparel Coalition to measure performance against sustainability goals. And now, as a number of retailers such as Farfetch and Zalando are using the Higg Index to measure the labels that they stock on their platform. So you need to be able to prove that you're going to help these influential roles within retailers and help meet those commercial objectives as well as those sustainability goals as well. And that will help to facilitate a much stronger relationship that will be a gateway to the other important roles that you need to have a relationship with in those businesses, such as merchandisers and buyers. Finally, it's all about creating noise and attention for your brand. And you can go viral with offline moments and localize viral moments as well as online. So don't be afraid to think outside the box and create really imaginative activations that help you to stick in people's minds. I'd like to leave you with a story about one of my favorite brands, Ted Baker. And this is from quite a while ago, but it's something that has always stayed with me as a very quirky story, but something that is actually now a part of the heritage of the brand too. So when Ted Baker launched one of its first stores, it actually wanted to stimulate a buzz among the people visiting, but it didn't have a huge marketing budget. So what it did was it cut up little bits of carrot into the shape of goldfish and it put it in plastic bags full of water. And it gave those as souvenirs to the first visitors of its store. And it was a really weird thing to do. But what it did was get people talking, because when those first visitors and those first customers left the store and were walking around the local area holding what looked like a goldfish, other people asked them why and where they had got it. And that drove further traffic to the store. And it was such a creative idea. And it was something that created enormous local success for that first store opening. And now that story has become a part of the Ted Baker brand story too. So in every product, you can find a reference to that first marketing campaign, whether it's a little bit of angling bait sewn into a product or a little reference to the goldfish motif sewn into the hang tags. So if you're a Ted Baker fan, or if you encounter a product from Ted Baker in the future, do look out for that motif. And you'll see how that first creative marketing campaign is now such a strong part of the brand heritage. That brings us to the end of the presentation. There is also another Q&A session where I will be joined by my co-workers at Vogue Business, Katie Clitricorn, Bella Webb, and Jasmine Gao from Shanghai. And it's a really exciting session where we're going to be answering some of the questions that have been submitted to us. So please do join that session. And it would be great to explore some of the other ideas that have been submitted to us by some of the viewers today. And finally, if I can just encourage you to visit the Vogue Business site as well. A number of the brands and initiatives that I've discussed today, there are lots of interviews and articles and reports on Vogue Business, and you find out a lot more information about those strategies on our website. I hope you've all enjoyed the presentation and that you're going to enjoy all of the other sessions taking place over the course of the programme. I wish you all the very best with your future enterprises. Thank you. Hi everyone, welcome to our Q&A session following the presentation for the Sitem Market Day. I'm joined today by my co-workers Bella Webb, Katie Clitricorn, and Jasmine Gao from the Vogue Business team. I'm just going to ask you to give a quick introduction of yourself. Jasmine, why don't we go to you first?
Yeah, hello everyone. This is Jasmine from Vogue Business in China. I'm the advisor manager here. It's my pleasure to join the session today.
Thanks for joining, Jasmine. Katie, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's nice to chat with you today. I'm with the Vogue Business team in London. I'm the retail and marketing editor. So I'm particularly interested in kind of new commerce models, I guess social media and kind of the retail and kind of internet trends.
Thanks, Katie. And finally, Bella, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me this morning. I'm Bella Webb. I'm an editorial associate at Vogue Business in London, and I write primarily about sustainability.
Thanks so much, Bella. Well, we've been sent some really interesting questions by some of the brands and businesses that are attending this event. The first question that I thought would be exciting for us to explore is how can the global commercial outlook of fashion make sense in a predominantly custom-made and handmade enterprises in this corner of the world? Bella, I'm actually going to come to you first because I know that you have thought a little bit about this question. What do you think about how the kind of businesses and brands that are scaling up in the Philippines can kind of make sense of that global commercial environment, given the custom and handmade focus of a lot of the brands in the Philippines?
This is a really good question. So when we look at the correlation between consumer sentiment metrics and brand purchase intent, the highest yields are good cuts and fittings of the clothes, which is 90%, high quality pieces, 90%, and rich heritage, which is 77%. So consumers are willing to pay more for craftsmanship and quality as opposed to fast fashion, which kind of suits the custom made and handmade enterprises in the Philippines. Now, many brands partner with local artisans in other parts of the world to where they sell. New York brand Brother Bellies, which is an accessories brand, partners with artisans in South Africa, Kenya, Mexico, Morocco, many other places as well. There are also some non-profits supporting responsible growth and creative engagement in artisan and maker economies. So Nest is one example, and they work to build greater gender equity and economic inclusion through programs that support the well-being of artisans in the United States and globally, which also links to the kind of push for radical transparency and the opportunity to support the informal handworker economy. Then elsewhere, brands like Ralph Lauren, Tory Burch, Carolina Herrera, and Isabel Marant are participating in something called the Craft Coalition, which focuses on bringing brands and designers together with artisans and makers to increase ethical sourcing with the community and maker interest at heart. That's their tagline. In London, there are multi-brand platforms such as Stories Behind Things, which specialize in the curation of sustainable products and brands. And they include narratives about craftsmanship on product pages and in campaigns. So having that kind of communications focus on craftsmanship and handmade really encourages people to appreciate the work that goes into making garments, so that they will, in theory, care for those items for longer. And then finally, in the luxury space, we can see brands investing in communications that highlight their craftsmanship, which is something that could be mirrored here. So Loewe creative director Jonathan Anderson speaks extensively about craftsmanship in videos that accompany his digital shows. Hermès has been a leader in relaying craftsmanship for many, many generations now. And as the house prepares to use mushroom leather and other kind of sustainable material innovations, it means that customers will trust the quality of that extension because there has been a focus on the handmade craftsmanship element. In France, Jacquemus communicates about its craftsmanship through the founder talking about his roots in the south of France. And in 2020, Alexander McQueen hosted an exhibition in its Old Bond Street store in the upstairs bit called Roses, which showed the details and craft behind its previous collections that link to floral narratives. So we have lots of examples of brands kind of highlighting craftsmanship and using that to position themselves within the luxury space.
Thanks so much, Bella. There are so many great examples there. That was a really rich answer. So Jasmine, same question to you. How do you think those brands that are so focused on that artisanal and custom-made approach can really succeed in a market that's so focused on that globalized approach?
Yeah, I think for like custom made and handmade actually can make the whole production line more sustainable, make the product more unique. Also, it can deliver a premium feel for the brands and the products. For a developing country like Philippines, it can also, attract the global brands. The high quality products can attract global brands to the production of Philippines. It can also, from broader view, it can also increase the job and trade opportunities for the local market and giving people there a better economic market.
Great, thanks so much, Jasmine. The next question that we had is one that I think is really interesting. And this again came from Emmy Englis of Duval Fashion Design Council. So it said, how can fashion schools help educate the industry to future-proof our local fashion? and its allied industries amidst the pandemic and anticipated kind of economic shifts from here onwards, which is a bit of a mouthful. Katie, I'm going to come to you on this question. How do you think that local fashion design schools can work more closely to kind of protect that knowledge, but also future-proof local fashion?
Sure. I guess a lot of it is to do with kind of like the unique, maybe cultural nuances. I find like I went to Japan for a couple of years ago to kind of visit the schools there, and I found that they were really different from the schools, at least in the UK and the US, where a lot of the education is centered around, I guess, creating store designers or kind of encouraging students to kind of create their own labels. Whereas I thought what was really interesting when I was in Japan was that schools like Bunker, they kind of focus more on teaching their students on the craft, kind of how to create the perfect stitch and seam. And, you know, for better or worse, they were against things like extracurricular activities. It was more like, if you have any spare time, you should really be just trying to perfect, you know, making this garment. And I think there have since been more kind of schools coming out of, again, places like Japan, like Coconut Goko, you might have heard of, or the Esmod outpost in Tokyo, that kind of try to challenge this convention of, again, just focusing on technique. So I think it kind of depends what you're trying to encourage your students to do and where they'll end up, because again, a lot of Japanese culture is they don't want to go work for a big brand. They just want to end up working for a Japanese company. They're quite kind of, I guess, patriotic in that way. They kind of want to support kind of like the local businesses. So even though maybe some other people might criticize that, you know, they're not really pushing the boundaries in terms of creating store designers, you know, they're not really confident enough to find their own voice and be creative. Actually, I do think that there are other kind of advantages, other things that they're learning in school. And I guess when you apply that to somewhere like the Philippines or, you know, any other country, I guess the question is, what are you trying to, you know, instill in your students? And I would imagine it's to do with like the craftsmanship, because I know you have some questions around slow fashion. And I think you can also do that by, you know, teaching them about things like new, again, commerce models or approaches like made to order or on-demand fashion. That's becoming a lot more popular, I would say, in Western markets. And I think a lot of designers are still learning about how, you know, how kind of like those business model operates. I also think that I always say that fashion is, you know, not just about trends, it kind of operates in the wider world. So again, just going back to Japan, because that's, you know, where a lot of my expertise is, they collaborate a lot with other schools. They invite guest lecturers, often from other industries, just so their kind of students kind of understand how their kind of work fits into the wider world. And then I think the last thing I will also say is that I've noticed more brands kind of like taking the steps to finance research or sponsor courses. So that could also be something maybe that could be explored. Kering, they work with LCF. And I know Burberry gave the Royal College of Art like something like 3 million to research into more sustainable materials. And I assume they picked those schools because they are British companies, but I'm sure there are kind of other like schools or brands out there that are kind of looking to invest in, you know, students and courses, because that's really how they'll also be able to, you know, advance their designs and their own kind of technology.
Thanks so much, Katie. You spoke quite a bit about, you know, at the beginning of your response, the focus on that perfecting the craft and getting the perfect stitch. And I guess one thing that I would add to that as well is it's obviously so important for students to get experience and hands-on experience. And it's a very competitive industry. So you often have applications and students trying to build relationships with the bigger brands, the ones that are going to be a name that stands out on their resumes. And I think institutions do that as well. They forge those relationships with larger businesses and brands that are going to help advance their students' careers, but also in terms of protecting the local craft or cottage industries and those more artisanal approaches, I personally think it would also be beneficial to have a focus on that experience as well, and making sure that students actually get to work with local craftsmen, smaller tradespeople that have retained that knowledge. So making sure that there isn't an overemphasis on just working with those larger businesses and larger brands, but also the smaller local craftsmen who are going to help to steward that knowledge as well. I think that's really important. And that hands-on experience is always going to be invaluable to someone starting out in their career. I think having that opportunity to work with people where it might be a family-owned business or something that hasn't gone global yet actually does provoke more creativity as well, because you really have to think outside the box about how you're going to expand that skill set from something that is, you know, produced in a very small capacity to something that could actually grow. So that's just a view that I have about making sure that that knowledge is retained as well through generations and not just through schooling. Bella, I'm going to come to you on this question as well. Do you have anything to add on this? How do you think that institutions can work more closely with brands, businesses, or their students to help steward that sort of local artisanal knowledge?
I think the only thing I would really add on this is that kind of building on that potential for collaborations with industry and problem solving. So when we talk about future proofing, not just thinking about the skills of the designers, the kind of practical skills of the designers, but also how they think and whether they're thinking in a way that matches where the industry is moving to. I know at Parsons, for example, in New York, they've done quite a bit of work around adaptive design and trans-inclusive design. They've done projects working with people rehabilitated out of prisons. There's all sorts of projects that they run which encourage designers to think about the social impacts of their work and the potential for fashion to enact social change and be more inclusive going forward. And then just building on what Katie said, there's lots of examples of brands and designers going into these schools as guest lecturers. A couple of sustainable designers that do this are Phoebe English and Bethany Williams. They both teach at Central St. Martin's, for example. And yeah, just kind of thinking about designing for end of life, for circularity, working with upcycling. I know there's quite a lot of brands, Alexander McQueen and Burberry included, who donate dead stock fabric to local fashion schools and specific students as well through scholarships. So that's potentially something that you could explore as well.
Thanks, Bella. And Jasmine, from the perspective of the region, the APAC region, what do you think of that question? How do you think fashion schools can help to educate the industry when it comes to future-proofing local fashion?
Yeah, actually, because I'm based in China, so from my observation of the market, actually, fashion school needs to educate their students or designer in like more professional use of the digital technologies. Because for now, in the market, the digital economy actually accounts for the most market share in the fashion industry. And the professional use of digital technologies actually can help the students, better capture their ability and also increasing the whole standards of the fashion industry.
Great, thanks for that, Jasmine. So the next question came from Neil Philippe from the Philippine Fashion Coalition. And he's asked us about the context of fast fashion versus slow fashion. So there's always been discussions between fast fashion and slow fashion, and seeing how the Philippines craftsmanship is more in line to slow fashion. How would fashion brands in the Philippines capitalize on this in the global market? Bella, I'm going to come to you first on this question.
Yeah, so lots of Western brands now are starting to run pre-order models. We're seeing this a lot within the sustainable fashion space as a way to encourage slow consumption. So to kind of match that slow fashion, the production side with the way that people consume as well. There are brands like, there's a cashmere brand called Ayuna, a small brand in London called Birdsong, and another multi-brand retailer called APOC, and they all offer pre-order now of, I think, 3 to 6 weeks, depending on the brand. And this is increasingly something that consumers are open to, especially with, as we were talking about earlier, the kind of narrative-led brands and brands where the communications around craftsmanship and why it takes a little bit longer to produce, or why it's maybe more sustainable to produce on demand, is part of their communication strategy. The other thing I would say is that there are lots of dedicated sustainable multi-brand retailers popping up now that cater specifically to slow fashion. So as I mentioned earlier, Stories Behind Things. There's also another one in London called Know the Origin. And then in the US, you have examples such as The Vertical and Toward, and they include different business models in their kind of communications approach and the way that they present brands. So some brands will drop ship, some brands will be pre-order, and that's all housed within the same multi-brand retail space. And they're really trying to communicate the nuances of why brands might operate on just different business models to consumers. And they do that alongside other kind of sustainability criteria, like having reef safe beauty, low water consumption, regenerative agriculture, recycled materials, whatever else it might be. The other thing I would say is that a lot of retailers and brands now are looking into service models, so offering rental, repair, resale, as opposed to new products, which is maybe a business model worth exploring. So just within the kind of multi-brand retail space, there's a few examples. Farfetch partners with the Restory for repair services, and ThreadUp for philanthropic donations and resale. And then you also have a rental pop-up in Selfridges in London, which is powered by a site called Her. They also partner with the Restory, and then there are other examples too, such as Net-a-Porter. The other thing potentially worth mentioning when you're thinking about business models is setting them up in a way that allows for what the market is increasingly demanding. So things like transparency and traceability. As consumers turn their attention to fashion supply chains, suppliers and manufacturing countries are coming together specifically around garment workers' rights. So last month, obviously, the California governor, Gavin Newsom, signed the Garment Worker Protection Act into law, and more than 140 businesses, including Reformation and Eileen Fisher, came out in support of that. In August, major retailers extended the Bangladesh Accord by 2 years. And then you have another example, which is the STAR Network, which stands for Sustainable Textile of the Asian Region. And that's a group of manufacturing countries coming together to set standards for what companies can do within contracts. So they can't delay payments like they did during COVID, things like that. So that's maybe another element to consider. One other thing would be the Lords Foundation and Shimmy are two companies which are kind of trying to understand shifts in sustainable production and adapt business models and supply chains to meet those changes. So that includes upskilling, AI-powered tablet-based training for staff, things like that. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Bella. I guess a couple of things that I would add on this question. Bella, you touched on some of the other models that are starting to emerge, and different white space channels like rental and resale. And I think that that's a space that some emerging economies haven't explored as much, while they're a little bit more advanced in Western markets. An example that I really like in the UK is a company called By Rotation, which is actually a peer-to-peer app for renting out your own clothes, your own wardrobe to other people. And historically, the ethos of the brand has always been about peer-to-peer sharing of fashion. and creating a community around that concept. But it is starting to work more directly with brands as well. So actually getting brands to put their inventory on this rental platform. So you're not just borrowing peer-to-peer, but you're actually able to rent directly from brands too. And because it started as that peer-to-peer format and started with that community emphasis, a lot of the participants were not just consumers, but they were engaged in the fashion industry as well. They were designers or they were creatives. And so it's already started to build a catalog of products from designers and creatives themselves in the platform. And that could be a really interesting model for new designers to work with. It's a way of maximizing your audience as well, whilst not having to completely overbuild all of your overheads on mass production. You actually are able to limit your small batch manufacturing, but enable a much bigger audience to access that. Another thing that I think is really interesting is there is a scarcity issue in the market as well. And that's a bit of a global problem. Some of that is down to availability of materials. We are living in a world where already problems with the environment and sustainability are impacting the availability of the materials needed for manufacturing. But the pandemic has obviously compounded that as well. So we've had the shutdown of factories, we've had lockdowns, and all of that has impeded production. Some brands are responding to that in a really interesting way. So just this week, Dior shared that it's going to be limiting its most popular handbag products to just one per customer per year. And obviously Dior has that brand collateral where it can create that sort of that sense of exclusivity and that demand. But I thought it was really interesting to see them doing that when you have a product that is so exclusive, that is produced in small batches, to actually have a limitation of that can stimulate even more demand, can make it one of those products that everyone wants to get. And I think that smaller brands and businesses certainly have that potential to do that as well, and communicate that it's not just about scarcity or the scale of your business, but actually it's about exclusivity and being able to get hold of something that very, very few other people are going to have. The next question also came from Neil Philippe from the Philippine Fashion Coalition. And he said, Philippines was always known as a premier manufacturing hub. How can the concept made in the Philippines become a globally recognized premium brand like made in Italy? And I think this is such an interesting question. I'm going to take it first and then I'll open it up to the group. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting when I was researching for the sessions was the Philippines has really exciting creative hubs like Cebu. And if you think about markets like Italy or France that are well known for luxury manufacturing, you don't just have the association of the market, you have the association of the regions where brands have really grown. So for Italy, Milan or Florence, like Milan is where the shows take place and where the excitement of the industry takes place, but Florence is a really important manufacturing hub for luxury. And in Paris you have in France you have Paris, which is again a really important meeting point for all fashion activities, but there are regional places where manufacturing takes place or where different categories thrive as well, like dress. And I think while people are still learning about Filipino fashion, there's probably less awareness of those creative hubs that are more localized like Cebu. And so one of the things that I would probably recommend is actually telling the story about those regions as well, so that on a global audience becomes more familiar with the stories of where creativity is coming from in the Philippines. And that makes it a lot more personal, it makes it a lot more accessible. And I think that at the consumer end as well, they're not then thinking just that like high level concept, oh, this was made in the Philippines. Actually, it becomes a lot more about storytelling and about the community that surrounds the industry. And I think that's really important when you're building a brand that is so localized, that is focused on the area where people are coming from. And I think that can be a really exciting way to tell stories about designers and businesses as well, because they've come from that community and they've been a part of that development too. Does anyone else have any other views on that about how you can elevate the status of Made in the Philippines or any regional localized activities?
Yeah, I can jump in. I kind of agree with what you were saying, Anisha, about the association of regions. And I feel like in terms of our coverage and like other people, that's definitely what you see with Italy. Kind of every region seems to have its own like specialty. Like you go to Como for the silk, or you go to like Biella for the wool, and like Prato for the fabrics. So I think that's where maybe the appeal of like made in Italy comes from. It's why you kind of like believe in kind of like the quality and the fabrics, just because every region has its specialty. And I also think there's something in the fact that a lot of Italian businesses are family owned. So there's this kind of idea that the knowledge runs from generation to generation. And I think that kind of also lends to kind of like the appeal of made in Italy. And I would also say from kind of a marketing perspective, it feels like there's a lot of positive association with Italy. Like a lot of movies are filmed there, like Roman Holiday. So you have immediately people like Audrey Hepburn associated with the country. And I think that's where, again, the idea of like quality, this is like a premium fabric, a premium place to buy from. And I think maybe that's one of the biggest problems with Southeast Asia. It's kind of a frustration that I have coming from Southeast Asia myself, that luxury is not really associated, I would say, in the minds of like the everyday consumer. I think if you ask anyone on the street, a lot of people, when they think of Southeast Asia and fashion, they think about like counterfeiting, or they think about fast fashion. And a lot of that is quite kind of like negative association, because it's all like synonymous with being unsustainable, or with unethical label, or poor worker rights, which may not necessarily be the case. But I think there's just maybe to what you were saying, Nisha, there's a lot more storytelling and a lot more education that needs to kind of go into it, so people in the wider world realize that it's not just counterfeits or, again, fast fashion that's being produced in the region. I think a lot of it maybe also comes from the government. I feel like it's quite an expensive task to take on. I always kind of look at what, for example, Korea is doing with fashion, with beauty, and even though maybe what they stand for is a bit different to what the Philippines might want to do, like the government is investing a lot in Korean exports, and a lot of that is also to do with marketing. I would also say on kind of like a larger scale, you see brands like Chanel or Dior or Hermes, and they spend a lot in education. It's years of marketing and influence. Their status was not built overnight. They often, I would say, kind of like open up their workshops to press, to influencers, so people can really come in and see all these kind of like men or women in their kind of perfection, kind of toiling away. And I think through that storytelling, they really kind of position themselves kind of like at the top of the pyramid of quality. That's what you associate, their brands with. But also going back to some of the things that, Bella was saying earlier as well about these brands and designers kind of in the West carving a role out for themselves as kind of like a slower, high quality alternative, when more people want personalization. And that's why we see all these kind of like made to order models emerging. We're also seeing smaller brands in the West do that as well. Emily Bode is kind of like an American designer, and she kind of explores ways to sustain tradition and old stories, but she's really able to communicate a lot of that through storytelling. And going back to one of your earlier points as well about kind of like these emerging designers, I would say too, the standout shows at New York Fashion Week this season, who I never heard of, but they were covered by quite big media like the New York Times, are Tristan DeWhitler and William Frederick, and they also kind of like presented their explorations of vintage textiles and craft. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's opportunity to show the more human side to things. I think, again, to show that there is someone making the garments, that it is ethical, and to kind of really lean more into like the storytelling element. I think there's a lot more opportunity there.
Thanks so much, Katie. I think what you were saying about the regional specialties of Italy was so interesting, because it brought to mind a Greek brand called Zeus and Dion, and I think they started around the peak of the last recession in around 2011, and I very clearly remember them talking about when they developed the brand, it was so important to them to support local crafts and local traders, and a lot of because of the recession, a lot of factories have been closing down, and they actually chose to work with a factory, I think a couple of factories actually, in a place called Sifli in Greece, which is very well known for silk. And actually by deciding to place their manufacturing for silk products there, they really revived the industry in that part of the country. And as they expanded their brand, they very specifically picked different locations within Greece that specialize in different textiles or different types of crafts like embroidery. And that's really clear in their story. If you go on their website, the Zeus and Dion brand really kind of takes you on a journey through Greece, telling you about where those different elements come from. So I think you make a really good point about that. And I love the examples you gave of brands that kind of open up the experience of how things are made to consumers as well. I remember a couple of years ago, Hermes kind of did a traveling trunk show and took the brand to markets that you would expect to be fairly developed, like Australia, but actually they knew that they needed to do some more brand building exercises there, and they had like a trunk show and workshops and enable people to come in and interact more with the artisans behind some of their more iconic designs, like the Birkin bag. And I think that those kind of experiences where consumers and even press and media have that experience, that have that opportunity to engage with the artisans behind brands, can also help to build that credibility, depending on what the story of the region that you want to tell there. Well, let's move on, because this is one of my favorite questions that was submitted, and I really wanted to make sure that we got to this one because it's a metaverse question, and the Vogue business team love talking about the metaverse, so it's quite a lengthy one. I'm going to see if I can condense it a little bit. So there are lots of examples of successful, well-known brands partnering with games on the metaverse, like Vans, or Vans partnering with Roblox, for example, or Gucci selling virtual limited edition clothing. Is there a space for small boutique brands to compete with these giants that have entered the space? What would your advice be to smaller brands that don't have the kind of retail footprint or resources of global brands to engage with the metaverse? I'm going to open that up to everyone. Why don't I take this one first? So when we talk about the metaverse at Vogue Business, we have quite an expanded definition of it. We don't just think about the shiny things like digital clothing and that kind of like virtual rendering of products. We also include things like NFTs, so non-fungible tokens in there as well. And from my research, I think that is a much more accessible way for smaller brands to access this kind of culture of engaging with digital fashion. There are lots of smaller brands and individual traders even that have accessed this space through NFTs and creating exclusivity through NFTs as well. So creating one-of-a-kind products that actually could live in the digital space, but in some cases are transcending that and living in the physical space, but the rights to that are enshrined in this digital kind of fixed certificate for it. And I think NFTs and having that kind of unique access and unique ownership of something in the digital space can be a way that smaller brands can interact with the metaverse space. I do know of brands that are actually experimenting a little bit more with this. It kind of depends on the resources you have, and I think you have to do this with authenticity as well. So one example is a tailoring brand called Joshua Kane in the UK. It has one store in the UK. He originally built his brand really through celebrity relationships, so dressing stars on the red carpet and making sure that he had a really strong brand story on social media. But as he scaled up his brand, he started experimenting with different cultural elements that are very close to his heart. And I think that's important because although the metaverse and gaming is such a big space and such an exciting space, I think it's really important that for smaller brands, they do this with authenticity. So for Joshua Kane, he himself is a big gamer. He loves gaming. It's something he grew up with, and he's created designs that have been inspired by some of the games that he used to play, but he's now flipped that and he's actually creating a video game that's inspired by characters that have been carried through his different collections. So he has a story that runs through some of his I guess signature collections called the Three Tailors, and now he's working on a video game inspired by that story of the Three Tailors from the Victorian era. And all of the environment and the character design, they all wear digital versions of his collection. So that's a really interesting example. But when I talk about doing it authentically, I mean, it's not just the digital space that he's doing that in, it's other cultures as well. So skateboarding has had a really big moment, and he created skateboards that had the design of his tailoring prints as well. So I think this is a question that's bigger than just the metaverse. If you're going to interact with another form of cultural expression, then it has to be something that is quite personal to the brand or the designer, or something that is a very close relationship, so that when that sort of expansion of your brand, so to speak, or when that expands from the designs to that new form of cultural expression, it doesn't jar with what you stand for. It doesn't come across as gimmicky, but actually it's very closely related to your brand story and heritage as well. Does anyone else have anything to add on that question? No? Okay. All right, well, thank you so much, Bella, Katie and Jasmine, for joining me. It's been a really interesting discussion. We had a lot to get through, and there are some really exciting examples in there as well. So thank you so much for sharing your insights and your perspectives on all of those questions. I hope everyone viewing has really enjoyed the session and found it really informative, and that you enjoy the rest of the sessions taking place today as well.